If you've got a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 2. This is where we'll be spending our time. I know that Advent has come and gone. We're a month and some change out of Advent now, but I want to follow the text where it leads. And I know we've already covered this material, but I'm going to cover it, I hope, today in a very different way than what we did when we looked at it over Christmas. So there are a lot of things about the Bible that as we look at it, I'm just going to say this, and maybe this is something that shouldn't be said, but I think it should be in my view. There are problems in the text. There are. And some of those problems are difficult things that need to be explained in some way. I think the mistake we make is to look at the text and say there are no problems in it, and then when we're confronted with one, to look away. Because I'm going to say, look, if God has spoken, then there are ways that these problems can be answered. And they can. And so for me as a Christian, I'm just not one of those who wants to look at the text and say, well, there's no problem. There are problems, but I think they can be faced. And I'll tell you, we've got a whole generation of kids coming up. Everybody, you may not be aware of this, but under the age of 30 in this country, 80% of all of those who grew up in churches have not returned. Why? You know what the number one reason is that they all give? My questions don't get answered. And so they say, none of this real. I'm going away and I'm not coming back. Now, I'm going to say that's a shame, because the questions can be answered. So let's take a look at this text and see what it would teach us today about our lives. I'll begin reading in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to be registered. So Joseph went up also to the town of Nazareth in Galilee, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the city of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was betrothed to him as his wife, who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time for the baby to be born came, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, we're going to look at the problems of this text in just a moment, and there are some problems here. There's one very specific one that has to do with the history, the coupling of what Luke says and Roman history. We're going to look at that. But I think it's unhealthy if we come to the text and think to ourselves that no matter what anybody says about it, that there aren't going to be questions that need to be answered. There are. Let's just be honest about that. Let's take the Bible for what it is. This incredible 1,500-year time span where all of the writers in it all spoke about one thing. That's pretty remarkable in itself. But sometimes some of the history requires a little work to work out. Now, first thing, the census, all right? The census was taken every 14 years in the Roman Empire. How do we know that? We've dug up the papyri. We've got papyri dated from 20 AD to 270 AD from the Roman Empire, all written with all of the details as to the fact that every 14 years they took a census. The census was to do just what a census does here. Have you ever been sitting in your house and you look out the window and you see somebody in a rather official looking car, and they step out of the car and they stand up in your front yard with a camera and start photographing your house? Yeah. What are they doing? They're seeing how much stuff you got so that they can know how the taxes are going to be assessed. And the funny thing is, they never go down. I noticed that. But that's what they did in the Roman Empire. You would have to go, and the reason that they go back to their home of origination is because back then, the lines of your family lineage meant a lot more than they mean today. I mean, for instance, if you moved to Atlanta, you wouldn't necessarily come back to Manor to fulfill the census requirements. You could do that from where you are, but that's the difference in the culture. The census did something else as well. Everybody in the Roman Empire who was a male beyond a certain age had to be in the military for a certain set length of time, no matter who you were, except if you were a Jew. Jews were exempt. You can see how that might raise some tension for families. I mean, can you imagine if you're a Greek family and next door to you is a Jewish family? Your little boy grows up in your home next door to the Jewish little boy. They play together, they grow up together, and then your boy has to go off to Carthage to fight a war for the Roman Empire. The Jewish boy doesn't have to go. I could see how there'd be some resentment there. It makes sense to me. God is using all of these mechanics, this history, He's using them to bring about something very specific, and that is that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. So here's the confusing element. Here's where the problem in the text is. And it all focuses on one person, and that's Quirinius. Obviously, that's a different baby book his mom and dad got that name out of. But Quirinius was not the governor in Syria. Syria is not the Syria as we think of Syria today. Back then, the northern part of Judea was referred to as Syria in the Roman Empire. That included Galilee and all of the northern parts of Judea. Quirinius was not the governor. Luke says he was. Here's the way this is reconciled. Quirinius was a military commander. Quirinius was overseeing Syria at the time as a military commander. It is likely, because they did this all the time, that they would take somebody who was not officially the governor, but was an official in the Roman Empire, and they would allow them to serve in certain capacities when they needed help. The census would be one of those capacities. How do I know that that's true? Because Luke makes the recording and he says, the first census taken by Quirinius. We know without any doubt that in 6 AD, Quirinius took another census when he was the governor. That's when he became the governor. So we know that. How could this be the first census if the second one was going to be the first one? That can't be. There has to be a first one. Quirinius' first census was taken as a military commander in Syria. So Luke got it right. Luke is a Gentile. That's another very significant thing. If you read any of these accounts in Matthew, you read Mary and Joseph headed for Bethlehem. Why? Matthew says, so that it would be fulfilled that Jesus would be born in the city of David, in the line of David. Luke doesn't record that. He doesn't say that. Why? He doesn't care. He's a Gentile. None of these Old Testament prophecies mean anything to Luke. Luke just wants to get the history right. He's satisfying his own mind, and he's writing this history for Theophilus. He wants to get it straight. So he doesn't care about these Old Testament prophecies. People who became Christians in the Roman Empire at that time in history, the first century, they weren't concerned about the Old Testament prophecies at all. All they knew was they'd been born again and Jesus had died on the cross for their sins. That was enough. Maybe they learned some of that later. Luke would have learned some of it later because Luke traveled with Paul. Did he get this information as he traveled with Paul? Most likely. Most likely. Now this is a scary time for Mary and Joseph. Matthew records that Joseph looked at Mary, pregnant, knowing it wasn't his, and said, I think I'll put her away. I'll divorce her. Now he had every right as a Jewish man. As a Jewish man, they had it pretty good. If your wife did anything that you didn't like, you could put her away. That was perfectly legal, uncontroversial within the Jewish system. Very patristic. So, Joe's wife is pregnant. He knows it's not his. What happened? She says God did it. Joe says, well, okay, but you know what? I don't want this trouble. I'm going to put her away. But this is what I find remarkable about Joseph. It says in the text he was going to do it quietly. That means he's not going to make a public spectacle of her. And there's a good reason for that, because if you were caught in adultery as a woman, you could be stoned. Now, we read that and we think, oh, that's terrible. Look, most of the time that didn't happen. These weren't people carrying around bags of rocks, just waiting for the next person that they could pelt to death. It wasn't like that. It was a rare thing that anybody would be stoned for adultery, but it was a possibility. And so Joseph, out of affection, says, I'm not going to make this public. And if you go and read Deuteronomy chapter 22 through 24, you can see that it was perfectly legal for Joseph to put her away quietly without the public trial before the Sanhedrin. He could do that. And so that's what he chooses to do. So there's a danger here, right? She's carrying the Son of God. Joseph, according to Luke at this point, is not sure about all that. Matthew tells us what happened. A dream came. God told him, don't be afraid to take her as your wife. What's growing in her is the Son of God. So you can take her as your wife. This says so much about Joe to me. That here's this guy who is sensitive to God, sensitive to his wife, sensitive to the culture. He didn't just throw her out. He didn't just put her away. He was willing to keep walking with her through this process. That says everything to me about him. Now, the text, I know that the Christmas cards all have Mary sitting on a donkey as they go to Bethlehem. And the donkey's smiling. I've never seen a donkey smile. I guess they can. I don't know. I know in the manger scenes you got ducks smiling, and I don't think they're able to take that piece of plastic that they've got sticking out there and make it turn up like a smile. But nevertheless, sitting on the donkey, I remember when Becky was due to deliver. I remember it. I don't remember it as well as she does, but I remember it pretty well. And I remember that she wouldn't, we had, our car was worn out. We had several 100,000 miles on it. It was really small. It was a two-door. Got to have a car we can put a baby seat in. So my job was to go out and shop for a used car, which I did. I brought the car home. The guy said, look, just take it with you and take it home and let your wife ride in. I said, well, okay. So I took it home. She wouldn't even ride in the car with me. She was so pregnant. I mean, this was so imminent that she didn't want to bounce in a car. Here's Mary. They got a 90-mile walk between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Between Nazareth and Bethlehem, they've got a 90-mile walk. If she's sitting on a donkey, that's bad. I mean, really, if you're that close. I remember when Becky comes to me on a Saturday before Jackson was born and says, we got to go to the hospital. I said, well, okay, let's go. So we got in the car, the car we bought that I picked out. We drove to the hospital, parked the car, got in. The first thing they told us when they put us in the birthing room was, they said, you need to get out of that chair. You need to go walk up and down the hallways. Why? Because it'll move things along. Mary's got a 90-mile walk. I'd say that'd move things along pretty well. These are tough people. And that's not where it ends. They go to the inn. Now the inn, in a lot of commentaries, they talk about caves. They weren't caves. There's some, but that's rare. Most of the inns were like this. How many of you have ever been hiking in the woods? Real hiking, not sort of hiking, real hiking. You have, yeah. You know why? Because you're from the Northeast. Nobody down here hikes. Why does anybody want to go out and walk in the woods for no purpose whatsoever other than to do it? In the Northeast, we hiked a lot. And if you were on an overnight hike, the best thing you could find would be one of those three-walled lean-tos in the forest where you could sleep off the ground and out of the rain. That's what these inns were like. There was a whole group of them in a kind of a horseshoe shape, three-walled stalls. And if you came to stay at the inn, you stayed in one of those. You built your fire in front, and there was a courtyard in the area where all of the animals, everybody brought animals practically, all of the animals would be tied and fed and watered, and that's where they would spend the night. The courtyard's where Mary and Joe are. That's how come there's a feeding trough out there. They're in the courtyard. Now, I remember, and think of it now, they're in the courtyard to have a baby. There's no midwife. There are no doctors. There's nothing clean or sanitary. They don't even have shelter from the elements, and they're going to have a baby. That's bad enough, isn't it? But it's really worse than that. They have the baby in the courtyard, all these people around, animals wandering around. You know what animals do. They reprocess stuff. They eat grass and it turns it into something else. and it's everywhere. And when the baby comes, they're going to lay the baby in a feeding trough. Have you ever come behind a bunch of cows after they eat? It's full of ick. There's this, it's like glue. But if you wet it, it reactivates it. So I can't imagine that Joe, I'm thinking of it as a dad. What is Joe thinking here? He's looking down and he's saying, what are we going to do with this baby? Mary's exhausted. She's just given birth with no help whatsoever. We've got this baby. We've wrapped him up in cloth. Where are we going to put him? Let's put him in the feeding trough. And so Joe, I can imagine he's taking whatever he's got and scraping this thing out to get it, the bugs and everything else that are in it, reasonably clean to lay this newborn in. I remember the birthing room when Jackson was born. They took us to the hospital. They got these circle of rooms. They got a desk out there with 8 or 10 nurses, all of them looking at the monitors. They got the heartbeat for the mom, the heartbeat for the baby, the blood pressure from the mom, the respiratory rate for the baby, the respiratory rate for the mom, and all those numbers, and they're just staring at them. And so if something happens, you got somebody 5 seconds away. That's where Becky did this. And so when Becky's time to deliver came, after 10 hours of labor, they said, we got to give you some help here. So they said, let's give you an epidural. You know what that is. That's where you don't feel anything from that spot down. So the doctor comes in, the nurse comes in, they wheel in this pole with the bags hanging on it. The nurse comes in, she whips open the package with the hose in it, and she gets ready to hook the hose to the bag, and she drops the hose on the floor. Now, I'm a lay person here. I'm just standing there. I don't really have a lot to do here at this point. Becky's the star of the show. So I look down, and the doctor, he's looking at Becky. He's working, got his gloves on. I said out loud, because I wanted the doctor to hear me. I said, you couldn't believe it. You had to be there. She picked the hose up off the floor. She took her finger and dusted the hose end off and was going to hook it to the bag and stick that in my wife's spine. I said, ma'am, do you really want to put that hose back together that you just dropped on the floor? The doctor heard me. I meant for that to happen. I was thinking, I'll do this so the doctor hears me. When he turned around, it was like somebody had given him an electric shock. He was so mad. Sent her right out, and in 10 seconds, she was back with another package and a clean hose. Mary didn't have any of that stuff. She didn't have any of that stuff. A clean hose, a hose of any kind would have been a help. For Mary, she's out there next to a feeding trough with animals walking around, having a baby outdoors. And I bet you Joe was just concerned and ashamed of all this. I wanted this to be better for my wife. I'm sure he did. Now, all of this difficulty with Jesus coming into the world, he comes. All of the difficulties that followed Jesus throughout his life, they did. What happened in John 8? Jesus gets into one of those arguments with the Pharisees, and what do they say to him? Jesus says his father sent him, and the Pharisees say, oh, wait a minute. We know who our fathers are. You don't. So that followed him. He never got away from that idea that he was illegitimate in their minds. No room at the inn, right? They come to that place, there's no space for them at all. I'm going to say that's a history fact that we can say, okay, we know that point of history. It's also a metaphor. It's a metaphor for Jesus all of his life as he went through his ministry. People didn't have room for him as he grew up. People didn't have room for him as he started to preach. People didn't have room for him as he hung on a cross. People didn't have room for him after he was raised from the dead. And they don't have room for him today. And I'm going to say for you and for me, for us, how much of life is really given over to room for Jesus in our life? Every day. Not just church day, but every day. George and I were talking about this before you guys got in here. How many times do we come to church and gather with and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, so don't hear me saying you, I'm saying we. How do we come to church, hear the gospel, study the Bible, and then go back and struggle with the same things we've been struggling with before we got here? We do. I'm wondering, as we look at our lives as believers, how much room do we make for Jesus? Really? The practical concerns of everyday affairs, right? They're there. We all face them. Doctors, taxes, work, family, house, peeling paint, whatever it is, plumbing that's busted. All those things, always, they never go away. I said to my wife one time, I said, one of the things about living in this fallen world that I find most troubling is I feel like, maybe it's just me, that I'm always being chipped at just a little bit, all the time. Never stops. Something is chipping away at what I would want to think of as I think about a life walking with God in this fallen world. I want it to be a life that's inspired and filled and contented and all those things that we say about what it is to know Him. But if we're really honest, we're just getting chipped at all the time. You ever go out there and put your car key in and you ring it off on the lock? I mean, stuff like that. Who makes that stuff up? How does that stuff happen? It's part of living in the fallen world. But I'm going to say, in this fallen world, we have a choice to make. And that choice is, how much room do we make for the Lord in our own lives with all that stuff going on? It's not going to stop. How much room do we make for Him in it? In the stuff in our own lives every day. No room at the end for Jesus. No room at the end for Mary and Joe. No room in anybody's heart when Jesus walked the earth except for a few. And boy, I wonder how much of my life looks like there's no room for Him in there. I don't know. A good test is to say to myself when I wake up, and for all of us, what am I getting up for today? What's the purpose for my living today? Is it to live for Him, to discover something of Him, to find Him so infilling within me that He's all I think about as I go through the stuff? Or is it just to live my life like everybody else lives theirs? He doesn't. It's a better way to go. It's better. Life is better when Jesus can walk with us, when there's plenty of room for Him in our lives. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question,